Hi, welcome back to Joe Blogs. In today's episode, I want to talk to you about what's happening in the Russian economy, and specifically to talk about Russia's overseas assets that have been frozen ever since it invaded Ukraine. Now, if you've been following the channel, you'll be fully aware that at the time of the invasion, Russia's total assets were sitting at around 600 billion, and around 375 billion of those assets were with foreign institutions. So this was basically money and other investments that Russia was holding in the USA, Europe, Canada, Australia, all the countries where Russia was doing trade. Now, as a result of the invasion, the financial institutions that were holding those assets were instructed to freeze them to stop Russia from being able to withdraw the money. And ever since that time, there have been calls for the West to use those assets to fund the war in Ukraine, to give the cash over to Ukraine to help it in its defense. But unfortunately, it's not quite as easy as just agreeing to do that, because there are laws in place, and the international laws say that those assets actually belong to Russia. And whether or not you agree with the ideology behind Russia's invasion of Ukraine, you can't just go around taking assets without any sort of legal backing. So there's been a lot of debate over the last 2.5 years as to how to deal with these assets. And the G7, which are the 7 largest economies in the world, historically, they're not actually the 7 largest anymore, because China and India are now in the top 7 as a result of their growing GDP. But the G7, which consists of the USA, the UK, Canada, Japan, Italy, Germany, and France, have now agreed a plan as to what to do with these frozen assets. So in today's video, we'll go through the details of the assets themselves, because it's not actually $375 million anymore. It's actually reduced quite significantly. So we'll have a look at the breakdown of those assets and where they're sitting geographically. We'll then talk about the G7 plan that has finally been agreed, what they're going to do with regards to giving some money over to Ukraine, how that's going to be structured, and how they're going to avoid all of the legal problems that Russia are going to bring against them. We'll then talk about how the loans that the G7 are proposing to raise are going to be repaid, what the structure is around that end of the deal. We'll take a look at the total amount of aid that's been provided so far to Ukraine and compare it to the new G7 plan. How significant is this new idea? We'll then have a look at what Russia's response has been to this proposal, and as you might imagine, they are not very happy at all, and there are going to be repercussions if you listen to what Russia is saying. And then finally today, I'll wrap up with my summary as to what I think the implications of this latest announcement are, both for the war in Ukraine and also for Russia's assets. But before we get started on all of that, I'd like to say once again, thank you so much to everyone that's supporting the channel. I know I've said this in every single video recently, but I genuinely mean it. This is the only form of communication that I have with everybody. So that's why I'm saying it, because I genuinely mean it. If you've sent me a YouTube super thanks or bought me a coffee recently, thank you so much for the time and effort and the generosity. Really, really appreciate that. Keeps me going. And if you're a long-term supporter, either through Patreon, where you can get early access to my videos and also watch them without any adverts, or YouTube membership, where you'll also get early access, or Buy Me a Coffee membership, thank you so much. When I first started this channel, I never dreamt that anybody would sign up for a long-term support deal to actually support me to make these videos. It really does blow my mind that you're doing that. Really helps to keep me motivated, keeps me focused, and makes me post more videos. So thank you so much. At the time of Russia's invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, it was estimated that Russia's total assets at that point was $612 billion. And those assets were split between its holdings of gold, cash, and international investments. And it was estimated at that point that 375 billion of those total assets were with financial institutions that are now deemed to be unfriendly by Russia. So basically, countries that don't agree with Russia's invasion of Ukraine and have subsequently applied sanctions against Russia. And this chart shows the breakdown of that $375 billion worth of assets, the majority of which were held either in investments, securities, or cash with foreign banks in those countries. And what this shows is that $207 billion worth of Russian assets were held in the Eurozone. The majority of these are held in Belgium, because that's where Euroclear is located, where a lot of the investments are held in European assets. The next largest holding of $67 billion is held in US dollars in the USA. $37 billion worth of investments were held in the UK, $36 billion in Japan, $19 billion in Canada, $6 billion in Australia, $1.8 billion in Singapore, and $1 billion in Switzerland in Swiss franc denominated investments. The financial sanctions that were applied against Russia following its invasion of Ukraine actually took some time to put into place. And in that interim period, Russia actually managed to move around $90 billion worth of assets out of those financial institutions into either Russia or other areas that weren't going to be frozen. So the total amount of the frozen assets today is actually $285 billion, so significantly less than it was immediately following the invasion, but still a significant number. And that $285 billion has now been converted predominantly into cash. So the investments that it was holding in terms of shares and bonds and other forms of long-term investment have now been cashed in. So all of these institutions are now sitting with accounts with large cash balances that are owned by Russia. And that cash generates interest and profit. If you leave your money in the bank, you expect to earn some interest on it. And that's exactly the same if you're a government. You put your money with overseas institutions and they will pay you the overnight borrowing rate or some form of interest on that. Now, as we saw from the graphic, the majority of the cash that's being held is actually being held in Europe. And the current rate of interest in Europe is 3.75%. So over the last 2 years, these assets have been generating around 4% per year. So over the last couple of years, these frozen assets have generated income of around $20 billion. And there's been two different camps in terms of what can be done with these frozen assets. The USA and the UK have been the most aggressive parties. They've been saying that all of the $285 billion should be used for Ukraine to defend itself against Russia. However, the European Union took a much more conservative approach, and they've said that they're not happy to actually take the capital, the $285 billion, but they are happy with the principle of skimming off any profit or interest that capital is generating. And as a result of those two conflicting views, it's taken a long period of time for the G7 to actually come up with a plan that they're all happy with. However, that has now been put into place, and let's talk about what that plan looks like. The G7 has announced that it's finally agreed that the interest being generated by the frozen Russian assets can be used to back loans that will be given to Ukraine to help in its war efforts against Russia. And the way that these loans will be structured, they'll actually be raised as bonds issued by individual countries, and these bonds will be long-dated money. So potentially they may be issued in perpetuity, so they won't actually have a repayment date, because the last thing that the G7 wants to do is actually bankrupt Ukraine by issuing it with loans that it can't actually repay at some point in the future. And the way that these bonds will be structured is that they will have an interest coupon, and it hasn't been announced how much this interest coupon will be, but it's likely to be a very low figure. These countries aren't issuing the loans to Ukraine to make a huge profit. They're not trying to profiteer from this arrangement. What they're doing is putting in place a commercial agreement that can be repaid at some point in the future. So I would expect that the interest attaching to these bonds will be quite low, maybe 1% or 0.5% or 1.5%, similar to the sort of interest that the IMF applies on its loans against countries that are bankrupt, because Ukraine is obviously in a dire financial situation right now as a result of the fact that it's fighting a war and it's lost a lot of its land and some of its income. Now, you might be sitting there thinking, hang on a minute, are the G7 actually using the frozen Russian assets themselves in terms of giving money to Ukraine? Or are they just using the profit that the financial institutions are making from that money? And you'd be right if you're thinking that, because it is only the interest that's being used to finance these bonds. They're not touching any of the capital. And the reason for that is that international law says that Russia owns those assets. So it doesn't really matter whether or not you agree with what Russia is doing in Ukraine. You can't just say, well, I don't agree with that ideology, so therefore we should take all of these assets. in retaliation. You need to have a firm legal footing to be able to do that. And the G7, and particularly the financial institutions involved, have taken legal advice. And the problem that the financial institutions have is that they've opened all of those accounts in the name of the Russian government. And if they're going to give the money over, they need a firm legal approval saying that it's now legal for them to give the money to the USA or the UK or Canada or whoever it might be. And of course, that's difficult without going through the international courts. Governments can make rulings in terms of what they think about what's happening in Russia. And we've seen lots of sanctions being put into place that are penalising Russian companies and the Russian state and individuals. But in terms of seizing assets and then actually liquidating them and using that cash for other purposes, you need to have a firm legal footing to do that. And that's one of the things that's holding the G7 back from actually just taking the 285 billion and handing it to Ukraine. But the EU and the G7 have got comfortable with the concept of actually taking the interest, the profit that is being generated by those assets. They're happy with that rather than the principal. And I actually think that's a really grey area, because if this was my money, if I'd put my money into Goldman Sachs and I was expecting to be paid interest, and Goldman Sachs turned round and said, actually, we've made a decision that you're not entitled to any of the interest, we're going to keep that for ourselves, but thank you very much for depositing all of your money, I would be pretty unhappy. And I also think I'd have a pretty strong legal case against Goldman Sachs to say, you actually owe me the interest. And I think that's one of the issues here, that Russia will be pursuing this in the international courts, because Russia doesn't believe that it's done anything wrong in terms of its invasion of Ukraine, and therefore it will fight tooth and nail to get these assets and the interest that they're generating back. So as we've just discussed, the G7 is not comfortable taking the frozen assets themselves. They want to skim off the interest, but they don't want to touch the assets. So you may be thinking, well, how are they ever going to be repaid? When these bonds actually do come round to being repaid at some point, they may be issued in perpetuity, they may be issued for 50 years or 30 years, but at some point in time, there will be somebody who's saying, you need to repay these bonds, please. How will Ukraine actually do that if it doesn't have access to the $285 billion of frozen Russian assets? Well, the answer to that question is that as it stands at the moment, Ukraine at the end of the war will be looking for Russia to repay all of the damage that it's caused as a result of its invasion. This obviously assumes that we don't have a peace settlement whereby Ukraine agrees to give up all of its rights. So if we do get to a situation where the war ends, Ukraine will then calculate how much damage has been caused, and at the last count, it's sitting at around $500 billion. And that is obviously going up on a daily basis, the more damage that's being caused. And so Ukraine will say to Russia, you owe us $500 billion. Now, I think it's pretty unlikely, but if Russia did say, okay, that's fine, and handed over $500 billion, then Ukraine could use some of that to repay the $50 billion bond. There is a question as to whether or not Ukraine would do that, because if it needs to repair $500 billion worth of damage and it receives $500 billion, then I think it would probably prioritise the damage payments rather than repaying a loan to the G7 at a very low interest rate. But that's the principle in terms of the first port of call. Now, if we get to a situation where Russia refuses to pay Ukraine, it says, we're not responsible for the damage and we're not paying you a penny, then theoretically, Ukraine would then have the right to try to claim the $285 billion that's sitting with all of these overseas institutions. And so Ukraine would go to the High Court and make a claim against all of those assets. If the High Court deemed in its favour, if it won its court case, then the financial institutions would then have a legal judgment that would allow them to hand that money to Ukraine, and Ukraine could use some of that capital to repay the loans. However, if neither of those two things happen and Ukraine doesn't come into a large amount of cash either directly from Russia or from Russia's frozen assets, the most likely scenario here is that these bonds could potentially be written off at some point in the future by all of the different governments. And in terms of who will actually be sitting with that debt, at the moment, the USA has said that it's prepared to issue the full amount of the $50 billion. However, the EU is currently in discussions to lend half of the money, so $25 billion. Canada has said it will lend $5 billion. The UK and Japan are also in discussions to lend $5 billion. So if everybody stumps up what they say they're going to do, the USA would end up lending $10 billion and everybody else would pick up the balance. So that's the sort of figure that would need to be written off at some point down the road if Ukraine doesn't come into a large amount of cash directly from Russia or the Russian assets. So how significant is a loan of $50 billion to Ukraine at this point in the war? This chart provides a summary of the total amount of aid provided so far by Europe and the United States. And the blue section of these charts represent the amount of cash that has been allocated, so the aid that's actually been given over to Ukraine. And the grey section of the chart is the total amount that's been approved but hasn't yet been allocated. And what this table shows is that so far Europe has provided $177.8 billion worth of aid, of which $102 billion has already been allocated to Ukraine, and the United States has committed to provide $98.7 billion worth of aid, of which $74 billion has already been allocated. So the total amount of committed funding by Europe and the United States so far is $276 billion. Now obviously Ukraine has also received aid from other countries outside of Europe and the States, and the estimated figure is running at around $300 billion. And when you put this into the context of the new $50 billion loan that's being raised by the G7, it represents additional funding of around 17%. So significant, but not life-changing in terms of the amount of aid that Ukraine needs. However, I think one thing that is really important in terms of this new loan is the timing. And this chart shows the monthly amounts that Ukraine has been receiving from the USA and Europe, dating back to the start of the war. The red bar charts show the amount of aid directly from the USA, and the blue bars the amount of aid coming from Europe. What this shows is that in the period between March 22 and June 23, there was a significant amount of aid provided both by the United States and Europe. However, over the last 12 months, there's been a significant reduction in the amount of aid being provided by the USA as a result of the delays that were seen in terms of approving the proposed aid package over the last 6 months or so. And over the last few months in particular, Ukraine has said that it's been running short of resources and desperately needs more aid. So the timing of this additional $50 billion that's coming in the form of this loan is really important. And also, there are concerns in the EU that if Donald Trump is voted in as president of the United States later in 2024, that there could be question marks over future aid coming directly from the USA. So the European Union is desperate to put this into place to make sure that Ukraine has momentum, it keeps receiving aid, and therefore it can keep on in its defense against Russia. As you might imagine, President Putin is not at all happy that the G7 has agreed that it can skim off the interest from the frozen Russian assets and use that money to fund loans to be given to Ukraine. In direct response to the G7's announcement, Vladimir Putin said that plans by Western countries to provide Ukraine with loans using interest from Russian assets frozen abroad was theft and would not go unpunished. Speaking at a meeting with foreign ministry officials, he said the way the West had treated Moscow showed that any country could fall victim to a similar Western asset freeze. He went on to say that despite all the chicanery, theft will certainly remain theft and it will not go unpunished. Now it is becoming obvious to all countries, companies and sovereign funds that their assets and reserves are far from safe in both the legal and economic sense of the word. Anyone could be next in line for expropriation by the USA and the West. Russian Foreign Ministry spokesperson Maria Zakharova said, "We know about the supposedly reached fundamental agreements within the G7 to provide Ukraine with a loan of $50 billion pledged against future revenues from managing Russian assets. Such a step will not lead the West to anything good. This illegal initiative, linked to attempts to pump up the Kyiv regime with money at somebody else's expense, threatens to completely unbalance the financial system and create cataclysmic crises. There is enough European property and money in Russia, as you know. Our government representatives have repeatedly spoken about this, and inevitable retaliatory measures will be extremely painful for Brussels, so they will have to pay for their madness out of their own pocket first and foremost." And former Russian president and chairman of the Russian Security Council, Dmitry Medvedev, called on Russia to mobilise against the West in response to the G7 announcement. Medvedev urged Russians on Telegram to inflict maximum harm on Western societies and infrastructure as payback for the sanctions imposed by the US and its allies. He said, "We need to respond not only to the authorities, the state, but all our people in general. After all, they and the USA and its allies have declared a war on us without any rules." He continued, "Hit them where it hurts, do damage everywhere, paralyze the operation of their companies and government agencies, find vulnerabilities in their critical technologies and attack them mercilessly. Literally destroy their energy, infrastructure, transportation, banking, and social services. Instill fear of the imminent collapse of all critical infrastructure." So what's the summary and conclusion today? Well, I wanted to post this video because we've been talking about these frozen Russian assets for the last 2 years. Ever since they were put on ice, there have been calls, predominantly from the USA and the UK, to seize these assets and hand over all of the cash to Ukraine to defend itself against the invasion. However, international law has prevented that from happening, and the European Union has been far more conservative than both the USA and the UK. They've always been putting the brakes on this idea, saying we can't do it because those assets are owned by Russia, and despite whatever they're doing globally, we can't just seize them and use them for whatever purpose we want. International law doesn't let us do that. However, the EU has agreed that the interest or the profit being generated by those assets can now be used for the good of Ukraine. And as a direct result of that, the G7 have now come up with this idea of putting together total bonds of $50 billion. And that will help Ukraine, but as we just saw, Ukraine has already had around $300 billion worth of aid, and the war is still going on, and they're still struggling to be able to push Russia back. So another $50 billion will be helpful, but it's not going to bring an end to this situation. We are not going to see an end of the war just as a result of this $50 billion loan. But looking at the economics of the situation for a moment, these bonds will be issued over a long-dated period, potentially in perpetuity, which means that they're never actually repayable unless Ukraine opts to repay them. And they'll be serviced using that interest. So basically, the interest on the bond will be offset by the interest that's being generated by the Russian assets. So they will be current, they will get paid, so you can show them on your balance sheet as being something that you might get the money back from at some point in the future. But the reality of the situation, as we discussed earlier, is that it's unlikely that Ukraine is going to have a spare $50 billion at any point in the near or medium term to be able to repay those bonds. And I think the most likely outcome is that at some point the governments who are providing them will write them off. And the G7 and the European Union have agreed to split these bonds. So the USA is probably likely to pick up around $10 billion, the UK, Canada, Japan around $5 billion each, and the balance coming from the European Union. So they are spreading it around. And basically, I think what we're seeing here is that these countries are just raising further aid. They're giving more money to Ukraine in a slightly different way. They're calling it something different. It's a reparation bond or frozen Russian asset bond or whatever you want to refer to it as. But essentially, it's just further aid being provided by those countries. Now, taking a step back and looking at the overall situation, is there ever a point where those frozen assets are likely to be dissolved and given over to Ukraine or the countries that are providing this debt? Well, I think the answer to that question really goes down to international law. If you could link an invasion, some sort of war event, to losing the right to your overseas assets, then you would have a strong legal case for the financial institutions involved to be able to take that money and do with it as they wish. But I don't think we've ever seen anything like that being proposed in the high courts. And unless that happens, we're going to see situations like this continuing. Whenever there's a war, we may see sanctions being applied, which are basically a way of trying to encourage that nation to stop doing what it's doing. That's what the sanctions against Russia are designed to do, bring an end to the war. They're trying to make it as painful as possible for the economy of Russia. However, Russia is carrying on. It's ignoring the sanctions. It's trying to get round them. It's trying to show that it continues to trade without the problems that are being provided by those sanctions. And as long as that situation continues, I think it's likely that we'll continue to see these assets remaining frozen. We won't see anybody trying to actually seize the capital. However, we do have a situation now where the G7 has finally agreed a deal whereby they can release some value to Ukraine backed by these assets in a loose format. And it'll be interesting to see whether or not the G7 agrees to increase the amount of these bonds going forward. This $50 billion worth of loans could be the first issuance. We may see further issuances. They may issue 100 or possibly even as much as $250 billion worth of loans against that $285 billion of frozen assets. Now, hopefully you've enjoyed today's episode. You found it useful, informative and thought-provoking. If you've liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up. Thank you for watching this video all the way through to the end. And here's something to put a smile on your face.